The early morning mist rolled in from the bay like a familiar visitor, brushing gently against the weathered windows of Eleanor Carter's old coastal home. Perched on a windswept bluff above Olympic Bay in the quiet town of Port, the house had withstood N. At 79, Eleanor had grown slower in her step, and her bones often reminded her of times passing, but her mind remained sharp, and her heart remained quietly tender. She had lived in the house for over 50 years, most of them alongside her late husband Samuel, They had built a simple life together, humble, steady, filled with long walks along the bay, evenings by the fireplace, and shared dreams whispered under patchwork quilts. Samuel had been a high school science teacher and a patient listener. Eleanor, once an art teacher, had always seen the world through textures, colors, and the hidden meaning behind everyday things. Together, they raised one son, Mason W. But it was their granddaughter, Scarlett, Scarlett had spent many childhood summers running barefoot through the grassy backyard, building fairy houses with seashells, and painting watercolor skies with Eleanor in the small sunroom they called the studio. Eleanor saw in her a spark, a curiosity not unlike her own when she was a girl. Now, at 27, Scarlett was engaged to be married to Dylan, a well-dressed. Still, love is not something you can steer for others. So Eleanor stood quietly on the sidelines as she had for most of her life, watching, praying. When Scarlett invited Eleanor to her birthday party, a formal evening event in a luxury penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle, Eleanor knew she wanted to give a gift that would mean something, a gift that carried the weight of love. In the quiet hours of winter, Eleanor began to work. She cleared a space in the sunroom, pulled out her sewing machine, and unfolded bolts of soft ivory cotton and pale green thread. The design had come to her one night in a dream. Scarlett and Dylan, dressed as bride and groom, standing in a garden beneath an arch of blooming wisteria, hand in hand, gazing forward into their new life. It took her 2 months to complete. Each morning, she would wake before sunrise, make herself a pot of chamomile tea, and settle at the sewing table with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands were slower than they once were. Arthritis had stiffened her fin. She embroidered every detail with care. Scarlett's flowing veil, Dylan's pressed tuxedo, even the small cardinal birds perched on branches above them. She used warm tones, dusty rose, muted olive, soft gold, and every thread seemed to carry a memory, a message, a prayer. When her fingers trembled too much to hold the needle steady, the border of the quilt was her favorite part, a frame of tiny vines that wove around the edges like the garden gate that once stood behind the old tool shed. She had taught Scarlett how to tie ivy there when she was only 6. The quilt wasn't flashy. It wasn't expensive. But it was real. And it was filled with love. A memory that anchored her. One day, as Eleanor rested between sessions of embroidery, she sat in the rocking chair Samuel had built and looked out over the bay. The water shimmered in silver-blue ripples beneath a soft winter sun, and gulls danced in the wind like careless children. Her thoughts drifted to a day from long ago, when Scarlett was 8. She had asked to paint the old gardening shed in the backyard. Eleanor had expected her to choose a pale yellow or soft lavender, something quaint and quiet. But Scarlett had chosen a wild, shocking sunflower yellow. "Oh my goodness, it looks like a caution sign," Eleanor had gasped. But Samuel had just chuckled and leaned down to whisper, "Let her turn it into sunshine." And so, they let it be. The shed stood bright and ridiculous for years, and every time Eleanor looked at it, it reminded her of that same stubborn, radiant joy Scarlett had always carried. That was the kind of love Eleanor wanted to leave behind. Not a check. Not a bracelet. Not an antique to gather dust. But something made. Something felt. A secret beneath the thread. Before wrapping the quilt, Eleanor took one final step. She unlocked the small safe beneath the floorboard in her closet and retrieved a sealed envelope. Inside was $500,000 in cash, a life's worth of saving, investing, and choosing simplicity over extravagance. She had planned to leave it as inheritance. But something told her, this was the time. She slipped the envelope beneath the quilt lining, folding the fabric carefully around it, ensuring it was secure but invisible. She didn't write a note about it. She didn't mention it to anyone. Her hope was that Scarlett would discover it in her own time, after the noise of the party and the lights of the wedding faded. For now, all Scarlett would see was the quilt, and Eleanor was at peace with that. Preparing for the party. The morning of the event, Eleanor stood in her bedroom, holding the box wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a soft green ribbon. She wore a gray wool sweater, her favorite pearl earrings, and a small gold pin shaped like a feather. Samuel had given it to her on their 30th anniversary. In front of the mirror, she paused. Her eyes, though lined with age, still held light. She smiled softly, then whispered to her reflection, "Let them see the love, even if they don't understand the gift." She picked up the package, pressed it to her chest for a brief moment, and exhaled. Outside, the sky was clear. The air was crisp. As she locked the door behind her and walked to the waiting car, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. She didn't know whether it was anticipation, fear, or simply the weight of hope. But she knew this. What she carried in her hands was not just a quilt. It was a piece of her heart. And it was now in theirs to hold, or to drop. The elevator chimed softly as it arrived at the 35th floor, the doors gliding open to reveal the kind of luxury that whispered rather than screamed. Marble floors, gold-trimmed fixtures, and a chandelier that looked like frozen rain dominated the penthouse lobby. Eleanor Carter stepped out, holding a gift box wrapped in pale tissue and tied delicately with a velvet ribbon the color of moss. It was small in her arms, but heavy in significance. She paused just outside the double doors leading into the suite, allowing herself one more breath. Through the crack, she could already hear laughter, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the familiar, razor-sharp voice of her son Mason holding court. His voice still carried that tone, polished, professional, slightly performative. She adjusted her shawl, brushed a stray gray hair from her brow, and pushed the door open. Inside, the penthouse gleamed. Every surface sparkled. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Seattle skyline at dusk, casting reflections of the guests in shifting amber and navy. There were easily 50 people, most in sleek cocktail dresses or tailored suits, each one seemingly curated for aesthetics rather than sentiment. In the center of the room, under a dazzling floral arch, stood Scarlett. She was radiant in an ivory satin dress, her auburn hair curled and pinned into a modern updo. On her wrist dangled a gold charm bracelet that clinked gently with every motion. By her side stood Dylan, his hand resting on the small of her back like he was staking a claim. Eleanor walked slowly, each step deliberate. No one noticed her at first. She approached the gift table, a sprawling granite countertop already piled with glossy gift bags and boxes adorned in black, gold, and cream. Her own package looked almost rustic in comparison. She set it down gently and turned to face her granddaughter. "Scarlett, darling," she said with a soft smile, opening her arms. Scarlett turned, her smile automatic and polished. "Grandma Eleanor, you made it." They embraced briefly, a 2-second press of fabric and perfume. Eleanor felt the distance immediately, measured not in miles, but in meaning. Dylan, ever the showman, turned with a grin. "Ah, the artist of the family. Nice to finally meet you." Eleanor extended a hand, which he shook lightly, his eyes already shifting elsewhere. The opening of the gift. It wasn't Eleanor's intention to make a moment of it. But someone, maybe, called out, "Scarlett, open Grandma's gift now." And just like that, 50 people turned their gaze. Scarlett reached for the box and began to unwrap it. She did so with care, at first, as if performing for an audience. The tissue rustled. The velvet ribbon slid free. The room quieted, wine glasses hovered in midair. Scarlett pulled out the quilt. The first thing she said wasn't, "Oh," or "Wow," or even a soft inhale. It was, "Is this hand-stitched?" She held it up by the corners, letting it unfurl like a flag. The garden scene Eleanor had labored over for weeks shimmered subtly in the soft lighting. The embroidered arch of wisteria, the soft figures of a bride and groom holding hands beneath it. Scarlett blinked, then let out a laugh. Not a nervous laugh. A sharp, practiced one. "It looks like something from a farmer's market," she said, glancing at Dylan. "Like one of those booths next to the beeswax candles and tie-dye scarves." The silence fractured. Mason let out a short chuckle. Dylan smirked. Someone from the back, Eleanor didn't see who, murmured, "Oh my God," as if unable to help themselves. Arya, ever composed, sipped from her wine glass with a single raised brow. Scarlett turned the quilt in her hands again. "Did you embroider this yourself, Grandma?" Eleanor swallowed. "Yes. I thought it might remind you of the garden behind the old house. You used to." But Scarlett had already turned away, folding the quilt quickly and setting it aside. "Thank you," she said with a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. "It's sweet." The conversation moved on like a current Eleanor couldn't stop. The DJ raised the volume. Glasses clinked. A waiter passed by with crab cakes. The moment vanished beneath layers of music and noise, like a fragile shell swept under by a wave. No one, not one soul, bothered to look beneath the lining of the quilt. No one found the envelope tucked deep inside, containing $500,000 in crisp, banded bills, saved over decades. She had thought Scarlett might find it later, maybe months after the wedding, in a quiet moment. Feel the love, the faith, the trust buried within that quiet gesture. But now Eleanor knew they'd never look again. They'd pack it into storage. Or worse, throw it out. Because all they saw was fabric. The stillness. Eleanor excused herself to the bathroom. Her feet moved across the polished marble like they didn't belong there. She locked the door behind her and turned on the cold water, splashing her face with trembling hands. She looked in the mirror. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She simply stared at her reflection, at the soft lines Samuel once traced with his fingers, at the mouth that had read bedtime stories and whispered lullabies. She saw herself clearly, possibly for the first time in a long time. In that moment, she realized the heartbreaking truth. They had never seen her. They had seen the woman who mailed checks at Christmas. The woman who made jam. The woman who stayed behind. But not her. Not the woman who had once painted murals in high school gymnasiums. Not the woman who had danced barefoot with Samuel under garden lights. Not the woman who had buried her best friend and built a life anyway. Not the woman who had stitched hope into cotton. And certainly not the woman who just gave away $500,000 to a granddaughter who couldn't see past the thread. The exit. Eleanor left before the cake was served. No one stopped her. No one noticed. The doorman opened the building's front door for her with a warm smile. She stepped outside into the crisp night air, the city buzzing faintly above her, but the sky was clear and full of stars. She walked a block before calling for a taxi. She didn't need to, but she wanted the time. Wanted the wind. Wanted the silence. As she rode home, Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest. There, her heart still beat, steadily, softly. And somewhere she knew this was not the end of her story. It was only the end of her silence. It had been exactly 1 week since Eleanor had left the penthouse party. The memory of that evening still lingered, like the aftertaste of something bitter that refused to fade. She hadn't spoken to anyone in the family since then. No one had called. No one had written. The silence spoke volumes. She told herself she wasn't hurt. She told herself she'd done what felt right. But even so, she hadn't been able to sleep well, not since seeing Scarlett's indifferent expression, not since watching her carefully stitched quilt being discarded like a novelty. That morning, needing space to breathe, Eleanor packed an overnight bag, wrapped her scarf tight around her neck, and drove out to the coast. The house by the bay, her house, always gave her a sense of clarity. It was where Samuel had proposed, where they had raised Mason, where she had once rocked Scarlett to sleep during thunderous August nights. If there was any place in the world that still belonged to her, this was it. The drive was familiar. Winding roads. Fog-tipped pines. Eagles soaring low over the water. She even allowed herself to feel a flicker of peace as she turned into the gravel driveway. Then she saw it. A black SUV, new, sleek, and wildly out of place, sat parked directly in front of her garage. Eleanor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It was Dylan's vehicle. A cold ripple ran down her spine. She parked beside the garage and stepped out slowly, pulling her coat tighter against the salt-tinged wind. The front door was slightly ajar. That alone set her heart pounding. Inside, voices echoed down the hallway. laughter, and the faint clatter of measuring tape against tile. She walked in. At first, no one noticed her. Scarlett was in the kitchen, leaning over a granite sample board. Arya stood beside her, tapping on an iPad. And a tall man in designer glasses, a stranger, gestured at a wall near the fireplace. If we knock down that divider, we could open up the entire front space. Better flow for guests. Maybe install sliding glass doors for a beitu ceremony transition. Eleanor stood motionless in the foyer. Scarlett finally looked up. "Grandma," she said with mild surprise. "We weren't expecting you." Eleanor's eyes moved around the room. The furniture was gone. The old blue reading chair, Samuel's chair, was nowhere to be seen. The bookshelf with her worn cookbooks had been emptied. The family portraits that once hung in a timeline along the hallway were gone. "I wasn't expecting to see a stranger planning my living room like a blueprint," Eleanor replied, her voice steady but low. Scarlett gave a tight smile. "This is Benji, our wedding planner/designer. He's just helping us modernize the space for the ceremony." "I never agreed to host the wedding here," Eleanor said. "Well, we assumed you would," Arya cut in, not looking up from her screen. "It's the perfect location, and the guest list is already being finalized with this layout in mind." Eleanor stepped further into the room, her shoes clicking against the polished wood. "Where is the blue chair?" she asked quietly. Scarlett blinked. "We moved it into the basement. It didn't match the theme." Eleanor turned to the stranger, Benji, who was still smiling as though they were discussing curtain swatches. "You can leave now," she said. He hesitated, glancing at Scarlett and Arya for guidance. "She's probably just overwhelmed," Arya said dismissively. "Why don't you take a break, Benji? We'll regroup in an hour." Benji nodded politely and left through the side door. As soon as it closed, Eleanor turned to face her granddaughter, her daughter-in-law. "I said no," she said again. "This is my home. My only home." Scarlett sighed, almost irritated. "Grandma, we're not trying to take it from you. We just want to make it usable, for everyone." Eleanor took a breath, steadying the tremble in her chest. "Usable?" she echoed. "Do you think this house was unusable when your grandfather built the fireplace with his own 2 hands? Was it unusable when you sat in the kitchen painting Easter eggs with me until past midnight?" Scarlett looked away. Arya stepped in, her voice professional. "This isn't personal, Eleanor. It's just logistics. We're hosting nearly 150 guests. And frankly, the house needs upgrades regardless of the event." Eleanor walked to the corner where the family photos had once hung. In their place was a mood board, photos of coastal wedding spreads, pastel color swatches, glassware ideas, and handwritten notes. Then she saw them, cardboard boxes, stacked carelessly against the wall. One had her name scrawled across it in black Sharpie. Miscellaneous stuff. She opened it. Inside were her old photo albums. A pair of Samuel's slippers. A pressed flower in a frame from their 40th anniversary. Everything sacred had been packed away like clutter. Eleanor's chest tightened. She turned around slowly. "Get out," she said. Scarlett blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said get out of my house." "You can't be serious." Arya's voice had a warning edge. "Eleanor, you're acting irrational. You entered my home without my permission. You rearranged it. You boxed up my life like it was garbage. And now you want to repaint my memories in beige and call it love." Silence. Scarlett's voice was small. "Grandma, I thought you'd be happy to be part of it. It's one day." "No, it's not just one day," Eleanor snapped. Her voice rose, not with rage, but grief. "It's the last place I ever danced with my husband. It's the last table he built with his hands. It's where I raised a child who now doesn't think to ask before tearing down the walls of my life." She was trembling now, tears threatening behind her eyes, but she stood firm. "I'm not just a name on a deed or a spare guest room in your plans." Scarlett didn't reply. Her eyes darted to Arya, who said nothing. Without another word, Eleanor turned and walked to the door. She opened it wide. "You are both no longer welcome here." They hesitated, unsure if she was bluffing. But she wasn't. Eventually they left, slowly, awkwardly, like children caught stealing. The door closed behind them with a quiet but final click. The quiet after. Eleanor stood in the center of the now empty room. The soft ticking of the clock was the only sound. She sank down into the floor beside the box marked with her name and opened the photo album. On the first page was a picture of Samuel holding baby Mason, standing barefoot in this very room. She ran her fingers over the image. "You'd have hated this," she whispered. "You'd have stopped it faster than I did." That night, Eleanor stayed in the house, alone. She lit a fire in the hearth using logs Samuel had chopped years ago. The warmth filled the room, chasing away the sterile emptiness the others had left behind. She knew now, with aching clarity, she hadn't just lost their respect. She had never had it. But in this house, in this space built from love, she still had herself. And for now, that would be enough. It rained that Sunday afternoon, the kind of steady, unremarkable rain that blurred the trees into gray-green smudges and turned the bay into a dull sheet of tin. Eleanor Carter sat in the corner booth of the Willow and Thyme Cafe, stirring her tea absently. Her eyes traced the droplets crawling down the window like hesitant fingers. Across from her sat Judith Rosen, her oldest and dearest friend. Judith, with her silver curls piled high and her cherry-red lipstick, had never believed in keeping things to herself. She had been Eleanor's confidant since college, through marriages, miscarriages, moves, and mourning. If anyone could help Eleanor untangle the knot tightening in her chest, it was Judith. "I still can't believe it," Eleanor murmured, her voice almost drowned out by the hum of conversation around them. "They were tearing apart my home. Not asking. Just planning. Like I wasn't even there." Judith set down her coffee and leaned forward. Her expression was calm, but her voice was steel. "Because in their minds, you're not there." Eleanor blinked. Judith didn't flinch. "I'm going to say something and it's going to hurt. But you need to hear it." Eleanor nodded slowly. "They don't see you as family anymore. They see you as a financial opportunity. A resource. Something to manage until it's gone." The wake-up call. The words struck Eleanor in the center of her chest, like a hammer against thin glass. "I've tried so hard," she whispered. "I gave everything to Mason. To Scarlett. I even gave them a quilt with—" She stopped herself. Judith noticed. What was in the quilt? Eleanor hesitated, then looked her friend in the eye. $500,000, she said quietly. Judith's breath caught. "This, I sewed it into the lining. I thought maybe she'd find it later, after the wedding. I thought, if she saw the love, the thought maybe she'd come back to me in some way." Judith's face softened. "Oh, honey." But she didn't even touch the lining. She called it farmer's market chic and tossed it aside like a napkin. Eleanor gave a bitter laugh. They all laughed. Judith reached across the table and took her hand. "They don't deserve you." The evidence. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table of her coastal home with her laptop open in front of her. She had never been one for technology, but necessity had taught her enough. And now, something gnawed at her, a gut feeling she couldn't ignore. She logged into her online banking. At first glance, nothing seemed off. But as she examined the login history, her heart began to pound. 3 failed login attempts from unknown IP addresses. 2 successful logins outside her usual location, Seattle. One of them had happened just 2 nights ago, while she had been asleep in Port Townsend. Her hands trembled slightly. She opened her email. A security alert sat unread in her inbox. She hadn't seen it before. Someone had tried to reset her password. Someone was trying to get into her accounts. Digging deeper. The next morning, she drove to her bank in town. The manager, a kind man named Jeremy who had once attended her art classes as a child, walked her through her recent activity and helped secure her accounts. "It's good you came in," he said. "But Eleanor, if someone's trying to access this, they're not guessing. They know just enough. Enough to be dangerous." The implication was clear. It had to be someone close. Back at home, Eleanor pulled out the dusty file box she kept tucked behind the bookshelf. In it were old papers, wills, insurance, property records. and also a small folder containing tax returns and bank statements Mason had once helped her organize. She flipped through until she found a photocopy of Mason's investment portfolio, something he had shared with pride 3 years ago. Back then, she hadn't understood half the terminology. But now, she read it with a different lens. There it was, risky real estate ventures. 2 failed startups. A ballooning credit card balance. An alarming second mortgage taken out on his own home. Mason was in debt. Serious debt. The confirmation. Later that evening, Eleanor received an unexpected call. Grandma. It was Caleb, her grandson, Mason's younger child, often quiet at gatherings, thoughtful in the way most others weren't. "I hope I'm not calling too late," he said. I've been meaning to talk to you." Eleanor sat up straighter. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Caleb hesitated, then spoke quickly, like someone trying to release a weight. "I was at Dad's house the other night. I needed to print something for school, and the printer jammed. I opened it up and I found documents. Financial stuff. A spreadsheet labeled post-wedding projections. Grandma, it had your name on it. And this house. They're planning to sell it. They're assuming it'll be theirs." Eleanor's breath caught. "There were notes," Caleb continued, like, "prepare title transfer, apply pressure before health declines, and secure power of attorney. Grandma, they're planning around you." He went quiet. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. I didn't think it was real." The breaking point. Eleanor thanked him gently, told him she loved him, and hung up. She sat in her living room for a long time afterward, surrounded by the silence of the sea and the ticking of Samuel's old mantel clock. A single sentence ran through her mind like a thread unraveling. "They don't need you. They need your money." She remembered every sacrifice, every birthday cake baked from scratch, every tuition check, every emergency fund, every gift mailed with a handwritten note. And yet, in the end, she had become a commodity. The realization didn't shatter her. It clarified her. She thought of Judith's words, Caleb's warning, the cold familiarity of her own son's entitlement, the absence of gratitude, the absence of respect, the house, the money, the quiet grace of a life well lived. It was never meant to be bartered or broken apart. It was time to protect what was hers. The first step toward taking back control. Eleanor stood and walked to her writing desk. She opened the drawer, pulled out a pen, and began drafting a letter. Not a letter of surrender. Not a plea. A plan. The morning light drifted through the lace curtains like a whisper, gentle, golden, and quiet. Eleanor sat at her dining table, her hands cradling a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea. She hadn't slept. Not really. The past few days had blurred together in a storm of realization, betrayal, and resolve. On the table in front of her lay a worn leather address book. She ran her fingers over the faded C embossed on the cover. After a long moment, she flipped it open and dialed a number she hadn't called in nearly a decade. The phone rang twice before a deep, calm voice answered. Marcus Bentley speaking. Eleanor took a breath. Marcus. It's Eleanor Carter, Samuel's widow. There was a pause. And then warmly, Eleanor. My goodness. It's been too long. How can I help you? She didn't hesitate. I'm ready to sell the house. A decade in a sentence. Marcus didn't respond right away. He had been Samuel's lawyer for nearly 30 years. He knew that house wasn't just real estate. It was legacy. A lifetime pressed into wood grain and faded wallpaper. Are you sure? He asked gently. No, Eleanor said honestly. But it's time. They agreed to meet the next day. When Marcus arrived, he brought with him a quiet professionalism and something else Eleanor hadn't felt in days, respect. He listened. He didn't push. He understood. I think you're making the right choice, he said, looking around the living room. Not because the house isn't worth keeping, but because you're worth more than how you've been treated in it. That sentence stayed with her. Before he left, he handed her a card. There's someone I trust. A private broker. Quiet, discreet, excellent at finding the right kind of buyer. Someone who won't bulldoze this place and turn it into a wedding venue. Her lips curved slightly. That would be a refreshing change. The quiet broker. 2 days later, Genevieve Lynn, a petite woman with soft eyes and a firm handshake, walked through the property with quiet reverence. She didn't take notes. She simply observed, occasionally brushing her fingers across the mantel, pausing at the window that looked out over the water. "This house has a soul," she said softly. "I'll find someone who sees it." And she did. In less than 10 days, Genevieve called back. "There's a buyer. A professor from the University of Washington. He's retiring early, looking for a quiet place to write his final book. He walked through the house once and said it felt like memory." Eleanor smiled at that. "That's exactly what it is." They made an offer at asking price. No contingencies. The closing date was set for 1 week before Scarlett's wedding. Eleanor accepted, packing the pieces. The next few days were unlike any Eleanor had lived in years. It wasn't the physical labor of sorting or boxing that exhausted her, it was the emotional excavation. Every item she touched held a heartbeat, a memory. She packed slowly, lovingly. She kept only the things that mattered most. The wedding photo, Samuel in his navy suit, hair tousled by sea breeze, and herself with daisy petals tucked behind her ear. The wooden box of his ashes, smooth from years of her fingertips resting there in prayer. And the quilt. She found it folded neatly at the bottom of a linen chest. It no longer hurt to look at it. The pain had cooled into something quieter. Not acceptance, never that, but understanding. The quilt had not lost its meaning just because others had failed to see it. She ran her hand over the embroidery. Scarlett and Dylan in the garden. A piece of her sewn into every thread. "Maybe one day," she whispered, "you'll remember what love looks like." She folded it carefully and placed it in her suitcase. One last morning. On her final morning in the house, Eleanor rose before sunrise. She made coffee. She sat in the armchair, the one Scarlett had once deemed too old-fashioned, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Outside, the sky bloomed slowly with color. Pale lavender gave way to peach and then to the warm amber of day. The sea was calm. She stood and walked through each room one last time. She didn't cry. She spoke softly to the walls. "Thank you for holding us," she said in the hallway. "For witnessing," she said in the kitchen. "For sheltering me," she said in the bedroom. At the front door, she turned back. "Goodbye, Samuel," she whispered. And then she walked out. The new beginning. Eleanor's new apartment sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood just outside Cambridge, Massachusetts, a university town filled with bookstores, jazz cafes, and gardens that reminded her of her early years. She chose the location deliberately. It was far but not too far. Private, but still alive with possibility. Her new home was smaller, of course. But it was warm. The windows caught the morning sun just right. And no one laughed at her quilts here. On her first night, she made herself a cup of tea, unpacked the wedding photo, and set it on the mantel. Then she took the quilt and draped it across the edge of her bed. That night, she slept soundly, for the first time in weeks. One letter not sent. 3 days after the move, she sat down and wrote a letter. Not to Mason. Not to Arya. But to Scarlett. She didn't write with anger. She didn't mention the party. She simply wrote. You don't have to see the worth in a thing for it to have value. One day, when life is quieter and your hands have created something from scratch, you might understand what it means to give away something you can never get back. Until then, I hope you find what makes you gentle. She folded the letter. She didn't mail it. Some things are better found in silence. Closing the door, opening the heart. On the day the sale finalized, Genevieve called to let her know everything was complete. It's officially done, she said. Eleanor thanked her, then turned off her phone. She opened a bottle of wine she had saved since Samuel's retirement party. She poured a glass. And she toasted, to herself. Not to endings, but to the quiet, courageous act of letting go of what no longer holds you, so you can walk freely into what does. The apartment Eleanor moved into wasn't grand by any measure. It sat on the 3rd floor of a modest, sun-drenched brick building tucked behind a florist and a family-owned bookstore in downtown Tacoma, Washington. The windows faced east, catching the first light of day, and in the early mornings, you could hear gulls and ferries echoing from the harbor. It was quiet, and for Eleanor, it was enough. After a lifetime of family obligations, social niceties, and invisible sacrifices, this stillness felt like breath. A kind of sanctuary. For the first time in years, she didn't feel watched. She didn't feel used. She felt free. The space itself was humble, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but she filled it with meaning. On the mantel above the fireplace, she placed a single photograph, Samuel holding her hand during their 40th anniversary party, both of them laughing, caught mid-moment. She had it framed in walnut, and every morning she whispered good morning to it like she used to. The quilt was folded neatly at the foot of her bed. She rarely spoke to Mason anymore. Arya hadn't reached out once. But that silence, once it would have cut like glass, now felt like peace. Not being needed was no longer terrifying. It was liberating. 3 weeks after she moved in, Eleanor's phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something in her bones told her who it was. She answered. "Grandma." The voice was tight, fragile. It cracked like dry leaves underfoot. "Scarlett." A long pause. Then a choked breath. Can I come see you?" Eleanor didn't ask why. She didn't ask what changed. She simply said, "Of course, darling. Would you like to meet for coffee?" The coffee shop. The small cafe around the corner was cozy and smelled of cinnamon and books. It had old mismatched furniture, soft jazz on vinyl, and baristas who remembered your name. Eleanor chose a table by the window. When Scarlett arrived, she looked nothing like the flawless woman from her birthday party. Her makeup was smudged, hair hastily tied in a bun. She wore an oversized sweatshirt and carried nothing but her purse and swollen eyes. She sat without a word. Eleanor didn't rush her. After a minute, Scarlett whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't call sooner. Her voice broke. Eleanor reached across the table and gently placed a hand over hers. Scarlett inhaled sharply and then, without warning, burst into tears. It was not elegant crying. Not quiet sobs. It was the kind of crying that comes from the gut, years of pride and pressure unraveling in public. The cafe hushed, but no one stared. When she finally spoke again, it came in fragments. "The wedding's off. Dylan's gone. Said I cared more about image than intimacy. He wasn't wrong. And the money? From the quilt." She looked up through tears. "I didn't know. I didn't even check. It sat in a closet until I gave it to Goodwill." Eleanor's stomach clenched. But she said nothing. Scarlett sobbed again. "I didn't just throw away a gift. I threw away your love." The stillness after the storm. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Eleanor spoke, not with anger, but with a softness that had once soothed Scarlett to sleep as a child. "We all miss things when we're rushing to impress the wrong people." Scarlett blinked. Eleanor continued, "What you discarded wasn't the quilt, Scarlett. It was the hours. The prayer in each thread. The memory of a garden that only you and I knew." Scarlett closed her eyes. "I remember that garden," she whispered. "I remember the bees and the red tulips." Eleanor smiled gently. "So do I." The real confession. "I was cruel to you," Scarlett said, tears still glistening. "Not just at the party. I've been distant for years. I let Mom and Dad shape how I saw you. As a woman stuck in the past. As someone who wouldn't understand ambition. But I was wrong. You didn't just understand it. You lived it." Eleanor tilted her head. "How do you mean?" Scarlett laughed through her tears. "You raised a family while working full-time, buried a husband and still kept going, and managed to love us even when we didn't deserve it. That's more ambition than I've ever had." Silence fell again, but this time it was healing, not heavy. "I want to do better," Scarlett said. "I want to know you. Not through holiday cards or bank transfers. Really know you." Eleanor's eyes softened. She nodded. The first step. They walked back to Eleanor's apartment together. When Scarlett saw the framed photo of Samuel, she paused. "I don't even remember this picture," she said. Eleanor smiled. "It was taken before you were born. He had just told a terrible joke. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the cake." Scarlett grinned faintly. You look happy. I was. And I am again. Scarlett walked to the bookshelf and picked up a book of pressed flowers. She opened it to a random page and gasped softly. These, from the garden? Eleanor nodded. I pressed them the last summer before Samuel passed. I didn't want to forget the colors. Scarlett traced her fingers across a faded daisy. Can I come again sometime? Maybe help you press more? Eleanor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You never needed an invitation, Scarlett. You just needed to stop seeing me as a relic and start seeing me as a person. Scarlett looked up. I see you now. That evening, after Scarlett left, Eleanor sat by the window, a cup of peppermint tea in hand, watching the city lights flicker in the rain. Her heart was full, but not from redemption or apology. It was full because she finally felt whole on her own. Forgiveness hadn't erased the past, but it had lightened it. She looked over at Samuel's photo. They're learning, she whispered. Maybe slowly, but they're learning. And so was she. The first cold morning of October arrived like a whisper through the window pane of Eleanor's apartment. Outside, leaves fluttered down in slow spirals, carpeting the sidewalk in gold and rust. Inside, a kettle hummed on the stove, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen, her hands cradling a chipped porcelain mug Samuel had once bought for her at a roadside flea market. Still standing, she murmured, rubbing her thumb across the fading floral print. Like her. Everything in this new space was modest, simpler than her coastal home, but it felt more hers than any place had in years. It was not filled with expensive things, but with intentional things. A pressed flower from the garden she and Scarlett once tended, a photo of Caleb laughing on a pier, a soft lamp that cast a halo over the books she had carried with her from place to place. She had not rebuilt her life. She had simply stepped out of the ruins of what no longer honored her. Memory as compass. That morning, Eleanor took out her journal, a soft-bound notebook with pages the color of sand, and began writing. Not a list. Not a letter. Just a memory. We were at the beach that summer, she wrote. Scarlett was 7. She found a broken shell and cried because it wasn't whole. But I told her, you're the only one who knows it's broken. To someone else, it's just beautiful. She paused, then added, it took me 79 years to realize I was talking to myself. On dignity. There was no ceremony to her transformation. No applause. Just choices. The choice to withhold forgiveness until it was earned. The choice to walk away without setting the bridge on fire. The choice to love herself enough to no longer shrink in rooms where she wasn't valued. She no longer felt the need to explain herself to Mason, or Arya, or anyone who reduced her legacy to a price tag. They had mistaken kindness for weakness. And for a while, so had she. The visit. One gray afternoon, Caleb came by with 2 mugs of cider and a bag of warm cranberry scones from the bakery down the street. He wore a college sweatshirt and carried a book on marine biology tucked under one arm. They sat together on the balcony, legs wrapped in wool blankets, steam rising between them like smoke signals of peace. Did you ever think, he asked suddenly, that family could disappoint you this much? Eleanor considered this. Yes, she said finally, but I didn't expect that it would also teach me what family really means. He looked at her, eyebrows raised. She smiled. Family isn't blood. It's behavior, she said. It's the people who sit beside you when your hands are shaking. The ones who don't need to apologize because they never made you feel small in the first place. Caleb looked down at his cup, quiet. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was the quilt, the one Eleanor had sewn, the one Scarlett discarded, laid out on the floor of a vintage shop in Tacoma. A handwritten note was attached, free to a good home. Eleanor's breath caught. I took it, Caleb said. I don't know why I stopped by that store. But it was there. I recognized the stitching immediately. He pulled something else from his backpack. The envelope with the money, still sealed. I didn't open it. I figured you'd want to. Eleanor held it in her hands, light, yet heavy. And in that moment she smiled. Thank you for seeing me, she whispered. The last reflection. That night, Eleanor sat by the window, a fire flickering gently behind her, a soft blanket across her knees. She stared out at the skyline of Tacoma, the way the city lights mirrored the stars above, and thought about all she had lost. And all she had gained. The truth was simple. She had not lost a home. She had not lost a family. She had reclaimed herself. It wasn't revenge that gave her peace. It was clarity. She had lived long enough to understand that life doesn't always give back what we give in. But that doesn't make giving a mistake. It just means we have to choose more carefully next time. The lesson etched in time. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by respect. It is defined by who shows up, not by who shares your DNA. It is defined by how they speak of you when you're not in the room, by what they do when you say no, by whether they value your history or see it as a burden. Sometimes, protecting your dignity means leaving behind the very people who once lived in your heart. Sometimes, love becomes theft, when it is asked without gratitude, when it is expected like duty, when it is manipulated like currency. And sometimes, the softest people are not fragile. They are simply tired of fighting for space in rooms too small for their spirit. And so she lived. Not bitter. Not lonely. Just quiet. She grew orchids on the windowsill and named them after constellations. She volunteered at the library on weekends, teaching a memoir writing class for women over 60. She wrote postcards to Scarlett once a month. Never accusatory, never too warm. Just consistent. Present. Scarlett had written back once. I still think about the quilt, she wrote. I think about what it meant. And I hope that one day, I'll be someone worthy of that kind of love. Eleanor placed that postcard in her journal. Not as proof of change, but as a reminder that seeds don't bloom on command. They bloom when they're ready. We often assume that family is forever, that blood obligates love. But that is a myth. True family is not inherited. It is earned through kindness, respect, and presence. Eleanor learned that standing up for herself didn't make her cruel. It made her free. Her worth was not measured by how much she gave away, but by how firmly she chose to stay whole. Sometimes, the most radical thing a woman can do is protect her peace. Sometimes, the bravest act is walking away from those who take you for granted. Not to punish, but to preserve. Not everything that looks simple is worthless. And not every older woman is weak. Some have just grown too wise to explain their value to people who never intended to see it. The morning of Eleanor Carter's 80th birthday was unusually still. The wind off the Puget Sound had softened to a whisper, and the sunlight poured in like gold syrup through the tall windows of her Tacoma apartment. She wasn't planning anything elaborate. No venue. No speeches. No catered menu. Just a table set for 5. A bouquet of fresh lilacs from the corner market. A teapot warming on the stove. And a plate of orange zest shortbread cookies cooling on a wire rack, Samuel's favorite, which she had learned to perfect even after he passed, as a way of keeping him close. Eleanor glanced at the clock. 2:45 p.m. 15 minutes before her guests arrived. Her gaze wandered to the framed photograph above the mantel. Samuel, beaming, with his arm around a much younger Eleanor, the two of them standing in front of their first house, the wind tugging at her scarf, her laughter caught mid-flight. "It's been a journey," she whispered, and she meant it. The guess. At exactly 3 p.m., the buzzer rang. She buzzed them in, heart warmed by familiarity. First came Judith, her closest friend, elegant in her wide-brimmed hat and wool shawl. Her voice, as always, was musical, full of stories and unapologetic opinions. Then Ethan, her soft-spoken neighbor who had helped Eleanor set up her Wi-Fi, her bookcases and, more than once, her perspective. And then Marcus Bentley, still sharp in his navy blazer, carrying a small lemon tree in a clay pot. "For your windowsill," he smiled. "Something that grows slowly, but surely." They settled in, tea poured, laughter bubbling up gently like a familiar melody. The conversation drifted from books to city politics to Judith's garden and Ethan's dog. The kind of gathering that didn't need permission to be meaningful. And just as Eleanor was reaching for another cookie, there was a soft knock on the door. The unexpected guest. When Eleanor opened it, she froze. It was Scarlett, but not the Scarlett from the party, the one in heels and diamonds and disdain. This Scarlett wore a thick gray sweater, sleeves pushed up to her elbows, paint stains on the cuffs. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun. Her eyes, wide, clear, and unguarded, held no demand. Only hope. In her hands was a small, wrapped box. Eleanor blinked. Scarlett. Hi, Grandma. A pause hung between them, heavy but not hostile. Eleanor stepped aside. Come in. Judith raised an eyebrow in surprise. Ethan stood and smiled politely. Marcus gave a quiet nod. Scarlett offered soft hellos all around, then turned back to Eleanor. I didn't want to come until I had something to give, she said. Not just a gift. Something true. Eleanor didn't speak. She gestured to the chair beside her. Scarlett sat, carefully placing the small box on the table between them. Happy birthday, she said, voice a little trembly. This took me 6 months. Phyllis. Eleanor peeled back the brown paper slowly, fingers gentle but firm. Inside was a quilt. Not a large one. Not like the wedding set. It was a wall hanging, carefully crafted with tiny, deliberate stitches. But it wasn't Scarlett and Dylan. It was Eleanor. Sitting by a window in her old beach house, sunlight spilling across her face, a steaming teacup in hand, her silver hair braided loosely over one shoulder. The stitching captured not just shape, but soul. Eleanor ran her fingers along the embroidery, over the fine lines etched at the corners of her sewn smile, over the strands of silver thread used for her hair. I've been taking art classes, Scarlett said quietly. Real ones. Not for galleries. Just for the sake of making something honest. She swallowed. I remembered the first time I held a needle. I was 7. You showed me how to sew a button onto Dad's flannel shirt. I made a mess of it, and you told me it didn't matter if it was neat. It only mattered if it held. Eleanor looked at her, heart suddenly full. I never forgot that. But I forgot you. And I'm sorry. The stillness that spoke volumes. The room was silent. Even the teacups sat untouched. Eleanor reached out and took Scarlett's hand. I didn't need the diamond, she said softly. I didn't need the money back. I just needed someone to remember why I made the quilt. Scarlett nodded, lips trembling. I didn't know how to say thank you, she whispered. So I learned how to sew. Eleanor laughed, quiet and crystalline, like water over smooth stones. And in that moment she knew. Not all mistakes could be reversed. But some could be redeemed. And not every bridge had to burn. Some just had to cool down before anyone could cross again. The ending that was enough. That evening, after the guests left, Eleanor stood in front of the wall in her living room. She found a nail, a small hammer, and hung the quilt, Scarlett's quilt, right above her favorite chair. She stepped back, tilted her head. The woman in the quilt looked peaceful, almost radiant. Eleanor sat down, tea in hand, and looked at her reflection in the window. Old, yes, but steady. She didn't need grandeur. She didn't need a crowd. She didn't need anyone to validate her worth. She had been enough all along. And now, someone else finally saw it too. That was all she ever wanted. And it was enough.